Well, Iran is now admitting it has exceeded a key limitation on how much nuclear fuel it can possess under the terms of the 2015 nuclear deal, a limit which was intended to prevent Tehran from developing nuclear weapons. Iran's breach marks their first acknowledged violation of a deal which, after all, the U.S. Congress never ratified and which President Trump ended. The White House releasing this statement in part, maximum pressure on the Iranian regime will continue until its leaders alter their course of action. The regime must end its nuclear ambitions and its malign behavior. Let's bring in American Islamic Forum for Democracy President Zuhdi Jasser. Zuhdi, thanks for coming in. So how should we respond to this?
Well, I think we need to continue the steady hand of continuing sanctions, and now Europe is going to finally allow their sanctions to kick back or snap back. And ultimately, the world should realize that we were being held to blackmail, that ultimately their terror in Yemen, their terror in Syria, the attack of ships, the sanctions, the attempt by them to increase the oil prices, etc., were all simply belligerent acts that proved that they were a terror regime. And I think today, if they really weren't about terrorism, they wouldn't then exceed the 300-kilogram limit. And it really shows that the entire nuclear deal was simply a lie, as Prime Minister Netanyahu said today.
Yeah, Zuhdi, it's Jonathan Honig. Thanks for being with us. Iran, as you know, has been at war with this country really going back to 1979. You mentioned Obama's Iran deal. We could even think about, the Salman Rushdie fatwa as an example of appeasement. Let me ask you this. Is the president's attitude towards North Korea, another nuclear threat, devil's advocate here, is that emboldening Iran? Is Iran looking at our appeasement of North Korea and saying, gee, maybe it wouldn't hurt us too long to hang on and get that nuclear weapon? That's what would give us power with the U.S.
Well, Jonathan, I think you're right in that appeasement elsewhere will have an impact on the esteem or the way they view the Trump administration. But I would not think that what's happening with North Korea is appeasement. I think simply having a meeting, I think continuing maximum pressure on North Korea is not going to be interpreted as appeasement by simply a meeting. I think the president would welcome a meeting with the leadership of Iran. We've actually imposed sanctions on Zarif himself, on the supreme leader, and others which were not done before. So I think they're feeling as much pressure as they can, and they're seeing the Trump administration consistent in that policy with other countries around the world.
Zuhdi, Christina Partsinevelos here. I'm just curious, could this be used more of a bargaining chip and maybe exaggerated on Iran's behalf? Because we don't actually know how much they are stockpiling at the moment. We also don't know the quality of it, because I'm not a uranium expert at all, but I know you can mix the quality as well. So could they potentially be lying and seizing on this opportunity to scare everyone else?
Well, that's a great point, because if they want to, I think one of the best questions is why are they doing this? Why are they showing their cards that it was a lie?
Yeah.
And I think it's because they want to drive Europe to try to change President Trump's approach. So they're trying to make Europe more weak-kneed, and I don't think that's going to work. Already it's showing that that's not going to work. So in the end, it's going to backfire and actually embolden the West to put more pressure on them and actually push them more into isolation.
Zuhdi, Jonas Ferris, I'm a little unclear. They didn't really violate anything since we left the agreement, right? I mean, this was sort of what they weren't supposed to do if we had an agreement, which we kind of got rid of. Is that true? And are we going to be moving to a new deal like Trump did with NAFTA with the redo, which basically was an improvement? Is he going to improve this Iran deal? Or that's just not even on the table right now?
Well, I think many aspects of the deal have shown that we did not have the ability to do the inspections that we needed to, and ultimately now they're proving that they were able to ramp up their production, even though they claimed to not have the centrifuges and other things that they needed to do it quickly, but they're doing it pretty darn quickly. So I think ultimately we're going to have to reboot it, and if they come to the table and if they care about their people and don't want to bring war, ultimately I think that's what's going to happen over the next few months.
So if they don't want to bring war, and obviously the U.S. does not want to engage in a conflict or a war as well, if you broaden it out, what is the end game here? Is it that the U.S. demand that they stop funding terrorist groups?
Well, I think the end game is a secure region in which they don't threaten our allies, they don't threaten Israel and Saudi Arabia, and we do not allow them to achieve nuclear armamentation. And I think ultimately that's going to have to be a new deal completely, and it's going to have to be the end of them driving the Houthis, driving Assad and others in the region, attacks against our assets in Iraq, as they've done, and also against ships. So there are many parameters that we can use as measures that we've achieved some pushback, if you will, or ability to contain them. But the end game is containment, and the people of Iran have spoken. It's in their interest, for the regime even, to begin to come to the table, because their economy is tanking and the people are speaking. And contrary to the op-ed that ran in the New York Times today, which might as well have been written by the IRGC, the people of Iran are not with the regime. The people of Iran are against them, and the regime is cornered as a minority, not as a majority, as the New York Times wants you to believe.
Well, quickly, Zuhdi, when are we going to see some action? We saw those protests in the beginning of the Obama administration, which the Obama administration did nothing to help support. Are we likely to see that again, particularly as we ratchet up the economic sanctions?
Absolutely, and we are seeing it. We're just not hearing about it as much as we should, but it is on the streets of Tehran, of and many of the cities are sort of smoldering in this protestation, and it will only continue with the sanctions. Feeding them the billions that we did, we're actually feeding the regime and allowing them to suppress the demonstrations, which now has not been able to be done. So that's why actually now they're getting a new life in the last 6 months that they've never had before. And they're not screaming death to America, they're screaming death to the Khomeinists.
All right, Zuhdi Jasser, good to see you, Zuhdi. Thank you for coming in again. Appreciate it. Meanwhile,
Anytime.
a suspicious